Hello, everybody. I'm here with Alexander Adams, and we're here to discuss iconoclasm. How are you doing, Alexander?
I'm doing very well, Luke. I will alternate calling you Luke and Lambda just out
I,
of
I, I like that.
of-
50-50 to keep both flames alive. Um, so, some people watching may not know what iconoclasm means. Perhaps you could start by giving us a bit of a definition.
well, iconoclasm means it literally comes from icon, which is image, and clasm, which is to break or the breaker of images. So iconoclasm is to do with the defacement, destruction, or significant alteration of images, symbols, pictures, and sort of sometimes sort of signage or words. And it's generally, and this is differentiated from vandalism, which is iconoclasm tends to be part of a movement. There tends to be an idea behind it, a specific ideology or religion or moral purpose. Vandalism tends to be individualistic, aimless, is associated with sort of pathology and mental illness and so forth. Iconoclasm is usually meaningful defacement. Vandalism is usually sort of just general pointless destruction.
I thought it might be useful to just read a bit of Exodus 32, which is when Moses smashes the tablets on the ground after seeing the golden calf. And some people would call this the first act of iconoclasm, but of course, maybe that's a statement that would annoy the half of the argument. So Aaron suggests to the people that they take off their gold earrings and everything they can find that's gold. They melt it all down and make it into a calf. And he says, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." Moses, meanwhile, is up getting the Ten Commandments. He comes down the mountain and he approaches the camp and sees the calf and the dancing, and his anger burns. He throws the tablets out of his hand, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain, and he took the calf the people had made and burned it in the fire. Then he ground it to powder, scattering it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. And hence inspired many generations of smashing statues, paintings, and Tupperware boxes.
Yes, oh yes, your famous video. Yes, I actually witnessed that because I was actually at the
Yes,
event and I saw that live.
you had to duck shards of
I had to duck
plastic.
and I cheered as I ducked. So
Great. Yeah. So um, after the this incident, the people of Israel are told a couple of times, "Do not make yourselves graven images or statues, and do not bow down to them." And then, in the aftermath of Jesus' arrival, the Christians are trying to figure out what laws should we continue to follow. We're no longer going down to the temple and sacrificing things. What about this question of graven images? And then, of course, there are increasing amounts of religious art being created, and this leads to the discussion that we're sort of talking about today, which is, as you say, the icon smashers, the iconoclasts, versus the icon kissers, which is the term that's been used for the people who venerate and celebrate the use of iconography. In the East, this really happens in the 8th century. Sort of, in particular, I think a guy called John of Damascus makes lots of very pro-icon arguments. I think that's at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And he sort of argues that Israel was told to make various bits of religious artwork and imagery, and so therefore the instruction not to make an image of God isn't straightforward, and you have to think about it with some subtlety. Most of the writings of the iconoclasts from that period we no longer have. In a sort of act of reverse smashing, they burnt all of their writings.
Yes, so you find waves of I mean, this is true throughout the Byzantine period, as you find waves of. There were so many changes of policy from the emperors and the church that there was this sort of toing and froing. So you had phases of iconoclasm and iconodualism, icon worship or use of. Yeah, and so there was this sort of. And it was sometimes related to theological. It was largely theological, but it was sometimes to do with power issues. And I think that there was one wave of the first wave of iconoclasm was due to there being some sort of series of natural disasters, and this was attributed to worship of icons. So this was prompted the fervor against icons as simply a way of reversing misfortune, I suppose.
And even though we think of this as happening in the maybe the 8th century in the East, the real wave of iconoclasm in the West happened as a result of the Reformation. So that's more like the 16th century. And after all, the councils, the ecumenical councils, basically said, yes, graven images are great. I think there was some back and forth about, is statues allowed? Maybe we should just have 2D images, but
there was discussion about statues and paintings, and then there was also discussion of, well, one of the main targets was not necessarily icons. It was also, I think, in particular in Byzantium, there was a great deal of discussion about relics. So you often had relics in churches. So there was this question of, when people worship, are they worshipping the saint or are they worshipping the object? So obviously, worshipping the object is essentially forbidden, but worshipping the saint or using the saint as an interceder was something different. And there was also discussion about, well, the justification for icons was that, well, okay, we have this thing about no graven images, but this is not people worshipping an idol. This is people using an image as a way of concentrating to reach the higher power. So they're not actually worshipping the object, they're using the object as a way of transcending, reaching transcendence. So there was this sort of definition, there was this sort of argument. I mean, it's quite an interesting argument over whether or not an icon is actually being worshipped or it is a vessel or a channel for worship.
Yeah. Now, I should say, I come to this stream from an iconoclastic tradition. I trace a lot of my theology down Reformed roots, and we were going to have Settlers Lament on the stream to maybe hold up the other perspective, but unfortunately that didn't work out. So perhaps. I'm just conscious we might not give a fair shake to the other side of the argument.
Oh, well, I believe I can uphold the banner for
Great.
Iconodualism. So, I should mention at this stage that if anyone who doesn't know, that I researched this and I wrote a book on this. So this is Iconoclasm.
Sorry, I should have given you a chance to plug at the top of the stream, but hopefully people at least make it 10 minutes in to see that. So where can people obtain this?
They can buy it on any online book website. They can also buy it through the shops, I think, at least in Britain and North America, I think elsewhere as well. It's very commonly available. It's also available as an ebook as well. So,
amazing.
Yeah, so I researched this book essentially in 2020 because we had the toppling of so many statues in America in May and June, and then we also had the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol in June 2020, related to the BLM protests and riots. And so this book came out of that, but it is actually, if anyone reads the book, they will find that there is many continuous links with the previous book, which I also have here as a good author. The previous book, which discussed, sort of the general leftward drift and the advances of progressivism. So I saw that the iconoclasm was kind of related to that.
What's the name of the previous book for people who are interested in that?
The previous book is Culture War, Art, Identity, Politics, and Cultural Entryism. That's also available from the same publisher. So the Iconoclasm book came out of my response. So my wanting to set the iconoclasm of recent years in the historical context. So this would mean going all the way back to the Bible and essentially looking at what are the roots of iconoclasm, because they are there in essence in the Bible, in the Scripture, and they've been applied sort of sparingly and more intensely over the years. And it's gone through phases, and I think we're going to talk about some phases later on. But so the reason I thought it was particularly useful to talk to you is because you being very knowledgeable about the Bible, that you can sort of help fill in some gaps as to what might be a viable reading of the Bible in terms of iconoclasm.
Yes. Well, I'll endeavour to both give a bit of an overview and also give my perspective. I'm just very conscious that there's lots of people who watch my channel who come to a different conclusion on this particular topic. So I will, I will say, I'll give you the verses and why I read them the way I do, but people have valid reasons to come to different conclusions than I do. So should we read a couple of the parts of the Old Testament where there are specific instructions that are related to this? So, for example, the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 start out with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And then, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath, in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parent to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandment. So the instruction there is not only not to worship an image, but it's actually do not make yourself an image. And clearly I think the bit we read before where they're making a golden calf, the calf was not supposed to be the god who took them out of Egypt. It wasn't, I know we just made this by melting a bunch of your earrings, but forget that. It was actually this calf that took you out of Egypt. It was, here's a representation of God. And clearly it's one of the earliest commandments, so extremely important. And it says, don't make an image. It seems like the human heart is naturally pulled towards worship of the created rather than the creator. And this commandment is saying, don't make the images, don't bow down and worship them. I am holy, and you need to be extremely careful when you're handling any kind of representation. So that's the very famous Ten Commandments. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
The police are coming to arrest me. I think that they've read my thoughts.
Your rides arrived.
So obviously this is a very good way for the Hebrew God, the Israelite God, to differentiate himself from all the other gods, because as far as I know, the Abrahamic faith of Judaism was the first to specifically forbid icons or any imagery. So that's obviously a fantastic way of differentiating people who follow your faith from the followers of all other faiths, not just the one of the golden calf, but of all of them. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, yes, you have. So this is something that's not commonly understood. So it's not just graven images. It says any likeness or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. So assumably, in the sea. So anything on land or sea, you can also depict. So this also presents you with an interesting thing where you're not actually. We're not just talking about like images or objects which are made specifically for worship. We're talking about here about all depictions of, I'm presuming here, living beings rather than ensouled beings, because I know that there is a differentiation. But here, specifically in Exodus, it talks about all beings, essentially.
Yeah. So, well, talking of comparative religion, of course, Islam is very strict on not creating any kind of representation or image, and some people trace the 8th century iconoclasm movement to actually Islam. That the Christians heard the arguments coming out of the Islamic world and thought, yeah, well, this sounds right to us. Although there's disagreement. Some people say it comes from sort of Neoplatonism. Some people just say it was ever thus, and actually the icon worship was the novelty.
Yes, so I did research on this, and I think the most recent book on this is the Leslie Brubaker and John Haldon book, Byzantium in the Iconoclast Era, and they are very much of the idea that this was an internal matter, that it was not a response to the rise of Islam. Although, of course, the rise of Islam was pressing on the borders of Byzantium at this time, so this was a live issue. But they said that this is the way they worded it. I mean, they did give quite a bit of attention to the matter, and they concluded that it was largely an internal matter, rather than a matter of sort of upholding Christianity versus Islam, or being influenced by Islam, or even by sort of like proto-atheism or anything, because all the disputants were all Christians, and there was no schism in terms of doctrine, apart from I think there was some talk about the rites, but the main one was the issue of icons and relics, because icons and relics are essentially linked in this early phase of discussion.
Let's read another couple of passages from the Old Testament. So in Leviticus 26, it says, "Do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God." And then in Deuteronomy chapter 4, it says, "You saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire," which is interesting. "Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourself an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, like any animal on earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or like a creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. And when you look up at the skies and see the sun, the moon, the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshipping things the Lord your God has appointed to all the nations under heaven. But as for you, the Lord took you and brought you out of the iron-smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his inheritance, as you are now." It seems clearly a response to paganism, right? Yeah. The nations around had a panoply of things that they were worshipping, and the Israelites, we can see the implication here. We can also see it recorded very explicitly through some of the histories, wanted to do likewise. That it feels like a natural human impulse to want to worship. You go out in nature and it is incredible. There's a sense of wonder in seeing the trees, seeing the animals, seeing humans and the stars and the moon and so on. Even I think we continue to see that there's pagan. There's an attraction to paganism even in our sort of online circles, that people still love the idea of worshipping these things.
Yes, and essentially that's one of the bedrocks of the ecological movement. And there are obviously conservative arguments for ecology and preservation and conservation efforts. So you can take it in different ways. You can go for the sort of the anti-humanist approach, but you can also go for the idea of the human people being the stewards of the earth on behalf of God. So there is also a more conservative religious interpretation.
Yeah.
And it does seem very clear that that this is a matter of a covenant. So you make the promise to God, and God will keep his side of the bargain. But your side of the bargain is that there's no icon making or icon worship. And obviously, clearly, in terms of making images, this is just not held up at all in Christianity. So, I mean, yes, there was this council in sort of the 8th century AD, and at that point there was a decision made which turned out to be essentially final, or lasting, I should say, and that was that the icons were permitted to be placed in churches. I'm not sure what the verdict was on relics, but a lot of relics have been completely destroyed and a lot of icons have been removed. But I think this was more specifically to do with the places of worship. So there obviously were icons that were in homes that were worshipped or used during worship. But I think that the decision of the council was essentially regarding churches and holy places and places of pilgrimage.
And the significance of this is that the ecumenical councils are considered, certainly in certain traditions, right? The Catholic and Orthodox position is that these are more or less divinely inspired teachings. So there's a serious issue if you later decide that icons are idolatrous, that the council is endorsing them, because you're then being told to do something that is sinful. Interestingly, the Lutheran position, I think, is that there are issues in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, but you notice in practice that lots of Lutherans do have icons, and actually, even though, of course, Martin Luther was very key in the Reformation, the iconoclastic piece of that doesn't seem to have been taken up by the Lutheran denomination as a...
Yes, that was something that I looked at in my research, because obviously Lutheranism and Calvinism are the questions of are the issues that come closest to iconoclasm in the religious context of Christianity. And it's true that Luther didn't actually advocate for the destruction of idols or icons. What you find is that you find sort of the logic of Calvin's concentration on the word, as opposed to the idea of the word is unalterable, but the image, of course, is it introduces innovation, and possibly sinful innovation, because of course people are inventing it. They're working on it every year. There are new ones being created, and it's easy to be led astray. But if the word is fixed, and obviously there's a degree of interpretation, but if the word is fixed, then the word is fixed, and that allows for less room for deviation or sinful innovation. So obviously that's why Calvin and Luther were so wedded to the actual words of the Bible. And of course, this meant that they were disassociating themselves from icon making, which is so easily can be sort of diverted or deviated.
Okay, shall we move across to the New Testament and think about what happened after Jesus? So, of course, one of the interesting questions is the issue that an image exists of God. God is a supernatural being, and therefore shrinking him down and making him into an image is to reduce his glory, potentially. This is one of the arguments. But is Jesus not called the image of the invisible God? this is one of the arguments that's put forwards, that actually God explicitly gives permission to create images, because in fact, doesn't John of Damascus? Sorry, I know we will get to the New Testament in a second, but it just sparked in my brain. I think it's John of Damascus also makes the argument that actually to refuse to make images of Jesus is to deny the incarnation, because it's a very significant question in theology whether Jesus really became man. And the church has been quite keen to be specific and say Jesus was genuinely physically there as a person, actually existed, actually had humanity and real physical form, and therefore to not depict him is to imply perhaps that you have you are heretical in some sense.
Or you have doubt. Yes, you have doubts. Yeah.
Yeah, like, you don't think Jesus could be depicted as human. Is that because you have some odd view of what actually happened in the first century? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Did you have any comments on?
No, I mean, I wasn't aware of the John of Damascus connection.
Okay. Well, let me read some verses from the New Testament. So, 1 Corinthians 10 says, "Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry." 1 John 5:21, "Dear children, keep yourselves from idols." This is a funny one because it's kind of out of the blue. There's no mention of idolatry for the whole letter. It just kind of pops up. Okay, so idolatry, its literal meaning is talking about a kind of a carved image or a physical object. But then you start to see this idea morphing a little bit. For example, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." That's Colossians 3, verse 5. And these days, if you go to a church and the passage that's being preached on is, for example, Exodus 20, and they're looking at the command against idolatry, generally, at least in this country, in England, in the UK, people are not at risk of idolatry in the sense of having a pagan idol in their house that they're bowing down to. And especially in Protestant churches, they probably don't have icons. So the way that this is being broadened and preached on generally, and I think this is valid, is to say anything that you worship and rely on in the place of God is an idol, and that could be your job. So now you are being idolatrous because you're treating your job and the security that it gives you and the happiness that you get from it as an idol in the place of God.
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting overlap with Islam, because there is they talk about shirk, which is unforgivable sin of false association, polytheism, and false authority. So it's the idea of there being authority or validity in some authority outside of the word of God. So this is sort of like secular authority, or so this is something that you see very much in the Islamists in ISIS, because they were saying, like, we're going to abolish the border between Iraq and Syria because we don't recognize because recognizing the state, just recognizing any state at all, is shirk, because it's sort of is idolatrous. It's the equivalent of idolatry in the Old, and the New Testament. So there's this idea of like the false idol, and that's related to false authority, and so you often get this conflation of false authority and being led astray by the senses, and being led astray by earthly concerns, and this is one of the things that obviously I know that a lot of the more this is something that iconoclastic religious types take very seriously, because they see iconoclasm as just simply the most obvious, the icon is the most obvious form of idolatry, but it's just simply one of a whole range of false authorities.
Yeah. So it's an interesting worked example of taking a specific instruction and saying, what are the implications of this? Where does it apply? Where doesn't it apply? Because the Bible is not like an algorithm you can go through, or it's not like a legal document. Although even legal documents work on precedent, don't they? You have to know how to understand the words that are there on the page. So the question is, I think the key question in the debate between the iconoclasts and the what did you say?
Iconodules.
Duels is this question of, is it idolatry to have this or that statue? We actually had a comment bringing up ISIS. Is ISIS destruction of heritage?
That's actually that's one of the examples that I used in the book, and it's not just ISIS as well, because I mean, obviously they were because I talked about the Taliban destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas, and theoretically these should be exempt, because this predates the word of Muhammad. So obviously, people who lived before I know that this is a discussion in religious circles, especially Christian circles, about people who the pagans who lived before, are they necessarily damned because they lived in ignorance, because the word of God was not revealed until later on. So there is this example of that, and then there's also, I take another example of the way the Wahhabis, who are strictly iconoclastic, the way that they essentially allied with the House of Saud, and a lot of the policy of Saudi Arabia is based on Wahhabi tenets, and one of those has led to things like the destruction of sacred sites, sites associated with the life of Muhammad. So various buildings or places that were associated with him have been deliberately demolished by authorities in Saudi Arabia, because they were seen as potentially idolatrous. So even just a building or a tree that was considered possibly a site of veneration, that was immediately destroyed. It's taking the Old Testament anti-idolatry to an extreme degree.
Yeah, well, so maybe that's a good tangent to go in here then. A related topic to this, I think, is how decorated are your places of worship, because those tend to go hand in hand, don't they? Places that are highly decorated tend to hold values that it's part of their worship to create beautiful objects and to inspire feelings of the divine by the surroundings that you're in, and create an environment that brings the worshipper into the presence of God through artistic endeavors. And I think that would include music. I think that would include ceremony and smell, and all just like taking advantage of the
vestments, the incense, and so forth, and also the liturgy as well. Like the cleaving to Latin, using the old forms. So obviously this is all to do with the style of not the style, the approach to worship. That this is related to, and this is something very
aesthetic concern, which is something close to your heart, of course.
Yes. So if people don't know, I'm an artist and an art critic, so I spend a lot of my time looking and making art. And this is something that I've mentioned, that I can't. Although I'm generally opposed to iconoclasm, I have a feeling that we do better to try and preserve things as much as we can to a degree, whilst also being aware of how we're being sort of led astray, not necessarily in religious sense, but in all sorts of senses by innovation and a sort of craving for originality. I would say that although I'm opposed to iconoclasm, you do get some advantages. So, for example, I think that what you get in the Reformation in the territory of the North Netherlands, which is now sort of Holland, now Netherlands, you do get the rise of Calvinism and Lutheranism, and you get these empty churches. You get the walls that have been whitewashed, the old decoration has been stripped away, tiles have been simplified, the stained glass is gone, the icons have gone, you have the whitewashed walls and so forth. And I do actually quite appreciate that as an aesthetic. And obviously the rise, or the way that Catholicism was, well, I think it was actually literally outlawed, or Catholic worship was not permitted. That opened the door to secular art. So you get things like, you get the rise of the still life and the landscape, and to a lesser degree the portrait in 17th century Holland, because people were not painting icons, people were not painting religious scenes. There were no, it was either so little in demand or so contentious that people avoided painting these religious subjects. And in turn, you had the flourishing of art of the still life and the landscape and so forth. So you do get some positive things out of iconoclasm, quite aside from any sort of spiritual improvement you might get. There are also side benefits.
Did this lead into Romanticism? The idea that we can I'm just thinking there's this curious push and pull between should we depict any imagery at all? No, because that's worship. But perhaps if we do it as a strictly non-religious move, so then there's this kind of dialogue going on of when we observe nature and we see the beauty in the wild and in skies and fields and so on, how should we react to that? Do we want to capture it, and if so, how do we treat that captured image? If we're in a culture which is Christian, then in some ways the celebration is of God's creation, but having those images, the aesthetic is it feels like, because obviously I grew up in this kind of culture where having an explicitly religious symbol in a work of art feels foreign and antiquated. So the kind of received art that I grew up with was almost it was almost like a camera trying to recreate literally what you're seeing, versus I think most of human culture, which is applying a much more active lens on top of what you see and interpreting reality. So not simply recreating what your eyes are taking in, but adding in information on top of that. Whereas I think the Romantic movement said that correct me if you know better, but the things that exist out there are to be celebrated in what you see. There is a beauty inherent in it. It's almost a Platonic idea, right? That there's a form out there that is beautiful in itself, and you don't need to add on to it extra symbolism and religious. Sorry, it was a little bit of a ramble.
Well, that's a hell of a question.
Pick something in what I just said.
Okay. Well, I'll say that there are two strong tendencies in Romanticism, and one is realism. It's like it is this sort of pantheistic worship of nature. It's this capturing of dramatic forms of, especially rugged landscapes of, and so forth. And you have the rise of the sublime. So the sublime is this idea that you encounter something which is so overwhelming, and if you're religious, you say this is an emanation of the Spirit of God. You encounter something so incomprehensibly astonishing that it overwhelms your logic and your rational reception, and it taps into deep emotion, and it draws deep emotion out of you. And that's the idea of the sublime, and this was an essential component of aesthetic thought. I mean, especially for people like Burke and so forth. And it was first articulated by someone called Longinus, who was a Roman writer. And so you have this response to nature as a way of worshipping God, if worshipping God is part of your ethos. And then there is this other one of this other tendency in Romanticism of explosion of imagination, and having fantasies and scenes involving figures which are fantastic. However, of course, that is very closely related to mythology and pagan mythology, Greek mythology, and so forth, which, of course, took a huge rise during the Romantic era. So that's obviously not specifically biblical or Christian in nature. So it's kind of contrary to that.
Yeah, I just fascinated by the question of whether the romantic impulse is a kind of a hidden paganism emerging in the culture. I don't imagine it would have been talked about that way by anybody at the time.
You did have sort of lots of agnostics and sort of maybe some deists or something maybe coming up. Deists rather than theists, who could work through secular subjects, because I think the expectation was that in the Dutch situation in the 17th century, where you had still life painters, they weren't expressing any dissent from religion. In fact, they were staying away from dissent in religion because it was such a hot button issue. So they were kind of expected to be Christian, whereas I think that with the rise of the Romantics, and of course associated with the Enlightenment, then you had more people who were explicit, and people like Bentham and so forth. You were people explicitly challenging the idea that you were innately religious and that you were innately Christian. That there was a sort of a rationalist alternative, and which is oddly, of course, associated with the expression of emotion and drama and mythology that you find in Romanticism. So it's kind of a complicated link.
Because there's probably a fairly strong argument that says if you are a part of an iconoclastic religion, you are ceding the all of the tools of the arts to anybody who opposes you, right? The type of imagery that you are putting forward, as you describe it, is quite is going to be plain and bare. And although there's a certain enjoyable minimalism in that, but that you're missing like the idea of festival or of splendor or majesty, and all of these are ideas you see in the Bible, and you look at the description of the temple, for example, that is described in quite a lot of details, and it's talking endlessly about all of the gold that's used to cover it. Solomon was renowned around the ancient world as having this remarkable opulent display, and that was partly an expression. Well, it was instructed that you would create the temple in this way so that you expressed to the world how devoted you were to God. So if people come into a very Spartan environment, there's a tendency for them to just react to it as these people are are not considering their god worthy of this kind of celebration.
Yes, that they're not paying their due respect. They're not. I think, as I saw you on a previous stream, they're not sacrificing their best calf. They're
Yes,
sacrificing the runt
yes,
of the litter,
right.
which sort of suggests a certain dishonor.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I mean, there is a certain compulsion to asceticism, where you're refusing glory, you're refusing luxury, you're refusing to be distracted, and it's
yeah,
one of the appeals of I think it's one of the appeals of radical Islam, is that you can simply say no. You say no. Everything has to go. Everything that came after this point is a sinful innovation. Every image is an idol. It must all go, and it's fantastically freeing, because
yeah.
you can be absolutely. It gives you a certain degree of certainty. Pun not intended. It gives you a degree of certainty, because you have very hard and fast rules that you can apply to everything, and you can take the extreme position, and you can't be too extreme. You can't go too far in your devotion to your particular cause. You can take it as far as you want, and you will never be going too far. So it actually frees you up. It's extremely liberating to have this very radical approach. So I can see why people get excited by iconoclasm, although obviously, personally, temperamentally, and sort of as a critic and a historian and so forth, obviously I lament that. But I can see why people get excited about the idea of purging, of purifying, of removing icons, especially if they are associated with deviation or embodying of sort of earthly power, or, for example, I mean, we don't want to get onto it too quickly, but the destruction of statues that are associated with the Civil War, with slavery, with colonialism, and so forth. Obviously, if you see those as symbols of the thing that you hate, it makes it so much easier to destroy them, to topple them, to deface them, to humiliate them. So yeah, I can understand the appeal.
Yeah. So maybe it's interesting to just describe my own emotional reaction to various forms of religious environments. This is something I've talked about a little bit before. So when I go into a great cathedral, for example, there's a sense in which I still have a knee-jerk negative reaction to the fact that I was always taught, and therefore it's quite deeply embedded in me, that this is wrong. This kind of expression of worship represents all sorts of problematic theology, and that it's tied to the church being used to exercise worldly power, and therefore I've taken the effort more recently to try to overcome this impulse, because I think there is a place in worship of God for bringing your best, and although Protestant churches often dislike visual art used in worship, they actually major in on music and try to create the best music that they can. Not that Protestants do this uniquely, but what I'm pointing out is that most Protestants don't have a problem with trying to create very moving, sentimental tunes that they sing hymns to. Some do, but often the most iconoclastic churches have this odd exception for this one art form. So I'm tending towards thinking that the iconoclasm movement, whilst it has a seed of correctness in it, does go too far and isn't entirely consistent in how it's applied.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's clear that an icon is not necessarily a physical thing. It might also be an art form. It might also be, sort of the liturgy, and the idea of worshipping, the host was, in the Protestant Reformation, the host was considered an idol in itself, and so it was sort of and there was quite a strong association between worldly luxury and the ornamentation of churches. So, for example, in the beginning, in the 1500s and the 1510s, you see an outbreak of iconoclasm in Switzerland in different places, and these were people who, and when they were tried, because actually, defacing an icon or beheading an icon was considered a capital crime. So some people were actually put to death for this. So they were actually they were very seriously committed, and it did seem like a serious religious commitment. It didn't seem like it was wholly political, although you do find some political aspects to the rise of Lutheranism and Calvinism, because it does seem to be associated with the rise of the burghers and of the merchants, as opposed to the church, the Catholic Church. So there is a sense of a little bit of struggle. But sometimes when these people went on trial in the sort of 1510s and so forth, they said explicitly that they took quite a socialist line. They said, it's wrong for these. I broke up this cross, or I broke up this statue to give it kindling to the poor. Or I was offended by the fact that there was oil put in these lamps daily as a result of a donation from a congregant to keep this flame alight when the poor have no oil, and so forth. So they were making explicitly social justice argument for iconoclasm, although it obviously was also a theological issue for them.
Yes, and we will fairly soon get onto the subject of how I think the modern progressive movement fits into this timeline. So I thought it was just worth one of the interesting stories I came across was one of the early iconoclastic decrees sent a little delegation off to tear down and destroy a statue, and a bunch of nuns refused to let this happen, knocked the guy off the ladder and killed him, one of the soldiers who'd been sent, and she then got sentenced to death by having a ram's horn put through her neck. So that was her punishment. So there's been quite strong feeling on both sides. Both people view this as you are doing something blasphemous against God, and we must stamp it out. And then on the other hand, you are defacing something which is an image of God, and therefore you in doing this action are actually doing something blasphemous. So the strength of feeling on both sides of this debate has been extremely strong historically.
Yeah, and I know that there was a lot of people assume that most of the destruction in certainly in Britain happened because of the Reformation, but actually, although that did happen to a degree, much of it happened during the Civil War, when Parliament actually went even further to do with the removal of icons and idols and rood screens and vestments and so forth. And a lot of the silver plate, silver, was taken from churches and used to fund the civil war against the royalists, against the king. So there was actually a financial impetus. And I know there was this big debate, and I'm sure it'll be raging in the comments and in the chat and so forth, about how motivated, or how was this a bottom up or was this a top down thing? The Reformation in Britain. And there's very mixed views. So there's some people saying, there was anger against corruption and venality in the church, and then there are other people saying, that actually the church was actually deeply embedded in the lives of everyone, and that there wasn't necessarily animus. There was animus towards certain individuals who were corrupt, but there wasn't necessarily animus to the whole to the church itself, or to particular, or even to particular practices. So so it depends on your historian. You'll get lots of points going either way.
So if my if I were to arrive at my church on a Sunday and they had put up a statue of Jesus or of Mary or something, or a painting up on the wall, I'd be arguing quite vociferously that it should be taken down. But I think I would be less clear whether I would want that artwork preserved. Would I want it destroyed, or do I just not want it up? And this question becomes even more pointed if we're talking about, suppose I have, I'm in charge of a building which is ancient, historically ancient, and has some works up that are, I become convicted that I think they are wrong because they are created as images that are breaking this commandment against idolatry. But I'm also aware that they are of enormous historical significance and great artistic value. So I wonder if you could put forwards the case for preserving the art, even in the case of not having it up.
Well, in that case, you could say, you might say that there is a problem because the presence of these images is interfering with the proper worship of God, in which case you just need to remove the artifacts, the items from the area that you are using to worship. So that's fairly straightforward. Keeping them, yes, I mean, obviously, if you want to try and preserve historical objects and you want to maintain an accurate record of culture, then you would attempt to preserve them. But there is also this issue of if you remove them, there is this question of the site being part of the art. Now, this might sound a bit odd, but for example, there was a case in America, in New York. There was an artist called Richard Serra. He had an artwork called the Tilted Ark, which was in a large plaza, and it was a great sort of basically a band of steel that was curved, and it was removed by the city authorities because they considered it a bomb threat or something. It wasn't really. They didn't approve of it, so it was removed. And the artist said, actually, even though you physically maintained the material, removing it is a violation of the artwork because the artwork is the object in that particular place. So you'll often find if you look at religious art, you'll find that some pictures were painted specifically to be in a certain position. So there was a Caravaggio there was a painting in a chapel painted by Caravaggio, and it's specifically using the light source that you have in that particular chapel. It's recreating that in the painting, so it's site specific. So it's designed to fuse the architecture and the picture. Also, for example, like the Sistine Chapel, if you cut out all those panels and you brought them in and put them into a gallery and you put them on the wall rather than the ceiling, then obviously they're going to take on a very different connotation. So you have seriously disrupted, and in some cases you've actually destroyed the artwork by changing the context because it was specifically made for that context. So that's a sort of one way of thinking about it, that the object in the place is part of the artwork. So
how should we think about our responsibility to preserve art? It feels somehow intuitive that if you destroy art, that's a negative thing. That creating something of value to somebody is good, and destroying something of value is bad. But I wonder if there are cases where you would think that the existence of a given piece of art can that ever be a negative for the world and for humanity?
Yes, I mean, Not okay. Well, strictly speaking, you might have an artwork which maybe is used to provoke hatred or intolerance. Now, obviously, if you're telling a narrative, if you've got narrative art, then you quite often have scenes where you have people doing something terrible to someone else, and of course, the most famous example is the Ecce Homo, or it's Christ carrying the cross. So it's the mockery of Christ, it's the scourging of Christ, and so forth. So obviously, this generates a certain degree of hostility towards the people, or I suppose by the transitive factor, the descendants of the people who were doing this terrible act. But I think I don't think that that's enough justification for the destruction or removal of art or the alteration of art, if it's serious art. But of course, that gets into the question of who decides what's serious art and who doesn't.
Yeah, well, and that also brings up another issue I was going to bring up earlier in the stream, which is I know in literature it's called the death of the author. I don't know if this is the same term that's used in other parts of the art world, but the idea that once you've created a piece of artwork, you as the creator of it are not privileged in your interpretation over anybody else, and therefore you can have a piece of artwork that exists, and two different people can have entirely different opinions about it, about what it represents, and therefore what one person considers to be an important and significant piece of art that must be preserved, another person could come along and say it's actually useless and doesn't mean anything to me, and I see no value in it.
But they would go further. They would say that's not even art. That's propaganda. That's a control tool for the privilege to use against the minority, whatever. Yeah. So this is obviously a problem now that we have postmodernism. But we do have that sort of death of the author stuff in fine art interpretation to a degree. And yeah, so once you get into that, you get into the question of, well, who's got more power? Who's got more influence? And that's one of the difficulties now, is that is now seeping. You're losing the more. I mean, I know that not everyone is a fan of the Enlightenment, but there are certain advantages, and one of those advantages is that you keep and preserve as much of your culture as possible. You make it accessible by researching and putting forward information in as neutral a manner as possible. Yes, there's no such thing as pure neutral. Okay, I understand that. But you're aiming that. That's your neutrality is your aspiration. You know that you will never get there, but it's your aspiration. It's the same way with perfection. Perfection can never be attained, but getting better is always a good method to have. It's always a good ideal to have, to improve,
because a lot of that perspective feels natural. I guess, again, because I've grown up in this post-Enlightenment liberal environment where it feels like as you say, our aim should be neutral. We should try to preserve everything and take this higher view that sits above the specifics of culture and says, let's go and find all the let's categorize all the ancient Greek books,
be analytical and empirical. Yeah,
exactly. And let's have a country in which there are all manner of religions being represented, and we want to allow expression of everything.
Then you enter multiculturalism, and then you reach the point of, well, you're not multicultural enough. We need to start enforcing this. You're looking a bit too, Britain. You're looking a bit too white and Christian in your heritage. Maybe we need to reflect who we are today, and that means that's not purely an additive process. That's a process of diluting, and it's a process of removing as well.
Yeah. Because one way in which you can destroy is simply by not maintaining. And maybe this could be viewed either as an active or a passive thing, depending on which side of the argument you're on, right?
Yes, and that. Oh, sorry. And now you have this system where the heads of the museums now are not really confident about the Enlightenment. They've been schooled in Marxism and postmodernism, and they think that, well, everything's a power game. So this idea of neutrality was always balderdash anyway. So yeah, so let's get on with start reflecting the way we are. Let's start a conversation.
Yeah.
Let's do some social justice, and that includes one of the examples that I've written about before was moving the bust of Sir John Soane from a privileged position. He was the founder of his collection was the foundation of the British Museum. There was a bust of him there, and it was moved to during the BLM stuff. The bust was moved to a case where it was set next to all sorts of explanations about imperialism and colonialism, and because he was his wife was associated with the plantation, so therefore, you have the director of the museum, who actually happens to be German, which I think is kind of interesting that a guest in our country is suggesting how we treat our historical figures, and he decided by fiat to move this bust to a place which was essentially demeaning. It's a sort of ritual humiliation of an icon or an idol associated with the Enlightenment, to do connected with history and colonialism, and this is an act of shaming it. So this isn't literally iconoclasm, but it's iconoclastic in spirit.
Because I think your point about context is really critical. That having a portrait of the headmaster of your school up in pride of place in the dining hall is an expression of celebration and reverence, and is an honouring of the individual whose painting is up. But simply adding a dunce's hat or something onto the same painting in the same location completely flips.
Not even. No, you put it in a series of paintings of monkeys.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
of idiots. Or
put a bunch of clowns next to them. Yeah.
Or the favorite thing now is that you put a little plaque below explaining all his particular failings, which is actually, you don't need to do anything to the painting. You keep the painting, but there is this system of retain and explain. Retain and explain often means you're not allowed to remove it, but you can put up a bloody great plaque which says this person is a diabolical fiend because of X, Y, Z.
So it seems like historically we saw these two extremes. One is having up the religious symbolism and so on in a mode of celebration, and the other side being smashing those things and destroying them, and that we thought we'd found an enlightened centrist position of we just observe, and we take an intellectual position, but we are so advanced in our, here we are in the 20th century, and now we don't need to, we're not as primitive as all the people before us, so we're not going to be influenced by either the presence or not of a certain image or a certain statue. But I think what you're saying is actually that position is washing away, because I think everybody's realised that it is significant what you do and don't have, and the position it takes in your society is an expression as much as the things that we say, the places that we live communicate to us and to people who visit us what we believe, what we care about, and it perpetuates to the next generation what they should think and
yeah. So what you'll find is you go to the National Trust, and one of the first things you'll see is a report on connection between slavery and the places that they were set up to preserve and to promote, and these institutions have been totally captured, I'm afraid, and we have reached a stage where it's come back to a sort of quite a primitive stage, where you have people literally drowning statues because this is associated, because the person who is associated with it was involved in the slave trade or profits from the slave trade. And the slave trade is ended. It's no longer legal. There are no legal slaves apart from certain ethnic and religious minorities who the crowd is the mob. The crowd is not going to be terribly bothered about protesting for. I mean, they weren't outside the local mosque protesting, sort of modern day slavery. They were outside protesting against the form of slavery which was outlawed 150, 200 years ago. And there is this feeling, there's this sense of evil emanating from these statues of historical figures, that people are going to get contaminated by this approval, this social approval of someone who served in the military in India, someone who was a governor of Jamaica and so forth. And there is this actual religious feeling of fear, of evil contaminating people. So it's actually quite, it's very sentimental and emotional and primitive. And this is something that's arisen out of postmodernism, which is supposedly the most ironic, the most scientific, the most detached, the most, but it seems to have awakened primitive fears in people.
I wonder if it's worth also talking quickly about the naming of things. So, for example, at work, we have meeting rooms, and those meeting rooms are named after people. And we had meeting rooms for Crick and Watson. And I can't remember which one. One of them's been cancelled, so we renamed that meeting room. The colleges at Cambridge and Oxford are given explicitly religious Christian names. So you have St. John's College, Emmanuel College, Trinity College. And actually, to me, I always found that quite uncomfortable. That sparked an iconoclastic impulse in my soul, that I was like, I don't like it being called Jesus College. That to me is inappropriate. But it clearly
it could end up being called Bill Gates College.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
George
So
Soros
what are we seeing
College.
now? The renaming of
George Floyd College.
It will surely only a matter of time. So how have the way that we name places and buildings and such been significant?
Well, it's well, you were mentioning University of Cambridge. Actually, in the back of the book, I've got a list of all. It's like a list of the fallen. It's like a Vietnam War memorial of all the buildings, all the statues that were toppled or removed by authorities just out of fear and so forth. And one of the lists is so I've got things that were removed from Britain, and then there's one. So the final entry in that is actually the stained glass window to Sir Ronald Fraser, University of Cambridge, 26th of June, was removed by the college authorities because he was positive about eugenics or something. I don't know. I think there was someone, Penrose, who was in favour of genetics or something like that. And so the naming, yes, obviously. So in June, I think it was June the 6th or June the 7th, the Colston statue was toppled here in Bristol. But I live here in Bristol. People know that, so I'm not kind of doxing myself. And Colston was a big donor to the city. There was, he was MP. He did a lot of work. He founded some almshouses. He founded a school. He donated money to the church. He was a benefactor, and that was why he was celebrated. He was celebrated because he was a benefactor of the city, not because he was involved tangentially with the slave trade. And of course, as soon as the statue came down, you had people the school, the Colston Girls' School, started to look at its name, and guess what? The staff, or the head and the board of the school, wanted to remove the name Colston, of their benefactor, of their founder, no less. They wanted to remove this. The parents were consulted, and they said they didn't want it. They wanted it to remain. They quite liked the association. They wanted to preserve this. And this didn't infer that they were in favour of slavery. People in Bristol are not generally in favour of slavery, so don't get that impression. But
Not anymore.
but so the school name was changed because screw the people. The elite in the school decided it's going because we read the Guardian and we have to do our bit to show we're a modern nation. So the school's name went. Also, Colston Hall is now, which was founded on Colston's money, is now, I think, is it Freedom Hall or Liberty Hall or something Orwellian.
Interesting.
So yes, I mean that's another form of iconoclasm.
Yeah. So it's I think unavoidable to see that when a statue represents the current powers, then toppling it is considered an attack on the power and is usually punished. And when there's a change in regime, you see that the statues that represented the previous regime are always toppled, like the statues of Stalin coming down, the fall of the Soviet Union, or the statues of, as you go on and list them. But building a tower of yourself when you're a leader has always been a sign of strength. And any kind of attack on the statue is seen as an attack on the individual, and then the reverse happens when the previous leader is being decried by the new leaders. You see statues falling. So that's obviously a part of what's going on with the statue falling that we're seeing now. But I wonder, do you think there's a religious lens as well?
Well, first of all, what I would say is that the attacks on statues are not counter authority; they are pro authority. They are sponsored and directed by members of the elite. So this is something that I discuss quite simply and directly in the book Iconoclasm. That I'll give you the example of the Colston statue. So the Colston, I've got an account of it in the book. So the Colston statue was unpopular with the local Labour Party, race activists, and the mayor is Labour. So they were trying to get it removed. They couldn't get it removed because the people of Bristol were consulted, and the people of Bristol said, no, we want to keep it. And obviously this was not acceptable for the elite. The elite wanted to get rid of it because, of course, it symbolised, well, whatever they wanted it to symbolise. So it symbolised oppression, racial oppression. So they couldn't get rid of it legally. So what they did was when the mob came it was a protest group. It was a protest crowd to begin with. But when they start committing acts of violence, you can describe them as a mob. So they became a mob. Not all of the protesters were involved. Not all of them approved. But a group of them did. They were the mob. The mob were permitted to topple the statue by the mayor, who told the police commander, do not intervene. So the police were there, they were standing back, and they watched the statue come down. So the statue was brought down not by the mob rising up against the powers that be. It was the mob controlled and enabled by the authorities. The authorities wanted to see that statue come down. So
yeah, and I think
this is something that you find in America as well. With the
really interesting at the beginning of the stream, you made the distinction between iconoclasm and vandalism, and actually, I think all of the examples that we've talked about historically of iconoclasm, as you imply, have been the new authorities coming in and they control the area, and then they stamp their mark on it by removing the expressions of worship of the previous group. And like we talked about ISIS, they sweep in, they control an area, they're in charge, and then they decide to take down the previous icons or whatever it was. Same thing, the Protestants, right? You have a Puritan movement sweeping across the country, they're in charge, and they say, well, we're getting rid of all this Catholic statuary and whatever. But it seems like we're seeing the same thing now, that the statues that were up were actually not Christian statues, in that they tended to be of political figures of significance. But whose ideas have now gone so totally outside of the Overton window that they're considered to be statues to a regressive political framework. And it's interesting. I actually, in a strange way, have always also had some queries in my mind about, do I approve of a statue being up in a town centre of a political figure? Because to some degree it does seem like a worship of a human. So there's a sense in which I think we should look at this through a religious lens and say the society that we're seeing the end of now that progressivism is taking over wasn't Christian. It wasn't worshipping God primarily, and you can see that in the way that they decorated their towns and cities. You saw the heroes of, say in America, you have a statue up of Lincoln. The thing that those people are, as the authorities at least, are wanting everybody to worship, is the political system that they're in. Now that a new political system is taking over, the previous political system, the worship of that needs to be stamped out. And presumably they're going to erect in place like AOC or Greta Thunberg or George Floyd, because these are the new figures of worship.
Yeah, very much. I think that what you saw, I'll disagree with you slightly because it makes the stream interesting. But
Right.
so for tradition, I would say for tradition, I mean, the statues that went up, they were either the religious icons, so they were, it would be Christ or Virgin Mary or whatever, or a saint, particularly a saint associated with the patron saint of this particular place. So it would be the city figure. But also you had tradition. The traditionalist would put up a figure, would put up a statue to mark the unique achievements of a particular person. And it was celebrating them as an exceptional figure, as a great man, as we've talked about in the Thomas Carlyle streams and so forth, the great man theory. The progressives only ever put up figures or statues. I mean, they're either generic humanist statues, which kind of give me a bit of a chill, but then there's also famous figures who are associated with the progressive movement, but they're put up not for their particular unique achievements, but because they are just simply symbols of oppressed women, or symbols of black people, or symbols of disabled people. They are there just as a token, whereas Abraham Lincoln is there, like him or not like him, for his own individual achievements, not as a symbol for something else, generally. So what you've got in the progressive movement is figures just being used as tokens, and this aligns with the leftist idea that there are no exceptional people, just exceptional circumstances. There's no such person who has great qualities, no one who is unique, or no one who has to make personal decisions and use their exceptional abilities or even exceptional luck, because the leftist believes that there's no such thing. That these are fake heroes. These are just people who were put up to inspire the masses to go to war, or to fight the foreigner, or to do whatever. So the leftist just doesn't believe in great men or great women at all, even though they might use, they might put up a statue, but they don't really believe in exceptional people.
And I think America has a particular focus on individualism, which you would see borne out in the celebration of individuals, and the transition away from that perspective on the world has been happening in the last 20-30 years. Peter Thiel points out that in New York there hasn't been a ticker tape parade celebrating an individual since the turn of the millennium. It used to always be, let's have a celebration of this person and their lifetime's achievement.
An astronaut or a retiring politician, right, or something.
Exactly, yeah, Neil Armstrong or whoever. But since,
or a sports hero.
But the last 20 years, it's been this organization, or let's celebrate this group.
Oh, yeah.
and that idea of the humanist art representing a very generic, very loose, abstract representation of humanity. Like, I mean, you mentioned the minimalist Protestant aesthetic in buildings, and I wonder if there's a through line there that you see to the corporate style of artwork, where it is flat shapes, everything being completely barren of embellishment. And so the most foreign thing, I think, to a modern globalist individual like we are all becoming, it is the kind of highly ornate, detailed kind of artwork that you see, like extensive embellishment on everything. Whereas increasingly the move is towards this this completely simple, flat, shadeless, textureless existence. Maybe my broad question is, what do you think's driving that aesthetic, and do you see seeds of it in the kind of Puritan into progressive?
Well, so public art is quite a big subject, but I would say in general you're seeing a lot of people who have lost people, because most artists now are not trained when they go to art school. They're not taught anything in particular. They're not taught any skills, and in fact, they're told that having skills or having something exceptional to say is a problem, because it sort of essentially harks back to the idea of the artist as genius, and of course that's been completely debunked by postmodernism and so forth. I think there's a lot of blandness.
The nail that sticks out gets hammered down, right?
Yeah, and that's why you have corporate blandness. So you have completely abstract stuff. So it'd be just like a sort of an explosion, a swirl, or some sort of generic thing that's based on the corporate logo or something, an interpretation.
Yeah,
of that.
not only does it.
Sorry, or you would have like a figure, like. So I'll give you an example of, again, come back to Colston because I know it the best. There's a sculptor called Mark Quinn, part of the young British artist generation. He did like a guerrilla intervention. So what he did was he saw a photograph of a black rights activist, whatever, who was standing on the plinth doing the Black Power salute. And so he saw that photograph and he contacted her and got her to come into the studio, and he did like a scan of her. He did like a 3D, he did a three-dimensional scan. He did a three-dimensional printout of that in plastic. He did this guerrilla intervention where he took that sculpture and like 2:00 in the morning, he turned up and at the plinth where the Colston statue was, and he set up this figure of the woman doing the Black Power salute. And of course, it was absolutely terrible art, and came out of nowhere. I mean, he lives in London. He doesn't know anything about Bristol. He just came in because it was a good stunt. Filmed by Channel 4 all the way through. They were invited to the studio so they were actually participating in this, and they filmed him setting it all up and stuff. And quite aside from the sort of the ridiculous opportunism, the sculpture itself was useless because it was just simply a scan of a person. When you're making a sculpture, you need to make alterations. You need to emphasize certain things. You need to reduce certain things. You need to alter the proportions, because you're not looking at it as you would a person on your level. You're looking at it from a different position. So you need to alter the proportions. So if you look at Michelangelo's David, you'll see that he's got much larger hands than he would have in real life. But that was a deliberate. That was a deliberate distortion by Michelangelo, because he understood this, because he'd been taught properly. Wow. Quinn hasn't been taught by anyone properly, and also he's using a 3D scan, so he can't make any alterations. So on that thought, I'm going to go and turn on the light while you speak to the listeners.
Great. Yes, I'll tell you what, while you're going, I'll read a couple of chats. So, just a reminder to go and buy Alexander's book, Iconoclasm. Southwest Samuel says, I always feel wrongly humanistic when I see the destruction of other religions' holy sites, part of me wants to keep them for archaeological purposes. And yeah, I think that is probably where I would ultimately come down on that. We have a responsibility to be thoughtful and quite brutal in the things under our control that are visible outward expressions. So I think we should be extremely considerate in how we dress, how we decorate our homes and our churches and our towns. And, if it's within our power, if we are the person responsible for making decisions, I think it is a question worth asking. Do you want this statue up? But once that statue has been taken down, if you think that's appropriate, then I wouldn't go in for smashing it to oblivion. Although I do note that that's what Moses did. He wasn't like, well, let's keep this golden calf around. Kind of.
Well, it would kind of undermine it. I mean, he didn't have any museum to put it in, so I think we can let him off. Yeah. Well, you have this question about do you want to start legislating the past? Do you want to start altering the past? Because one of my arguments in the book was that, people on the left, they say they're speaking for marginalised people. No, of course we know, but they're not. They're actually using marginalised people as a tool, as a client of the state, in order to achieve their progressive aims. But ostensibly, they're supposed to be supporting the marginalised and the people who we don't listen to. Well, how about listening to the dead? Because the dead are never going to say anything new, because they're dead. What they've done is they have left us with their speech. They have left us with what they valued. And that is in the form of books, in the form of culture, physical culture, including statues. If you start removing that, you are censoring the dead. I think that we should allow them to speak, even though we may disagree, we may have different views. I don't think we should be legislating retrospectively to give us some sort of moral boost, some moral kick. Attacking the dead is the most cowardly thing of all, because the dead can't fight back. And I think that just indicates something about what progressivism is like.
There's an extent to which there is a polite opinion amongst the masses that we do, as you describe, we attempt to learn the truth about all things, including the past. And then there's a cold reality, which is that those in power will make every decision in favour of their own power. And one of those tools is editing the public understanding of history. And of course, then to control the past, you need to have various mechanisms for destroying evidence that goes against what you believe.
Yeah, and so narratives are formed of allowing certain truths to be known, allowing other truths not to be known, and also telling lies. And that involves editing, that involves removing history. It means distorting it. And it's like, you can literally see it with the plaques, when the plaques are applied, you know what you're supposed to be thinking, you know what the regime thinks, and the regime is completely posed. It's completely part of the progressive movement. There is no institution which has not been completely subverted. I mean, like even British Museum, National Gallery, there's all National Trust, all of them. They're all signed up to the progressive agenda. They're all reading the same. And people say, "Oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theorist." No, it isn't. It's people reading the same newspapers. It's going to the same universities. It's having the same goals. It's having the same value. In the same way, you could say that. This story about an outcast group of monotheists who were living in the catacombs in Rome. They came to power. They influenced really important people, and they managed to change the hub of this great empire. And that's no conspiracy theory. That's the rise of Christianity.
Yes,
it happens.
Yeah, we see attempts to alter perceptions of history being done very openly. For example, dramatizations and documentaries of the past where they deliberately tried to make it an inclusive portrayal by introducing characters of all skin tones, all sexualities, and attributing opinions and perspectives into the past that are completely ahistoric. But the idea is that if people believe that an opinion they hold is recent and is historically unknown and is passing out of fashion, then they'll release it as being something that a weird oddity that they happened to be born believing, but now should cast away, right?
And as I've discussed in other recent streams, it's an NPC thing. It's something that happens where you believe something completely. So you believe in bodily autonomy, and you believe in my body, my choice, right? So I mean that's pretty right on. That's the right opinion. And then of course like a certain medical situation arises. Not going to name many names. Certain medical situation arises, and then suddenly it's like, oh no, you've got to do your bit. You've got to undergo certain medical procedures in order to help us all out. So you've got to do your bit, and that changed overnight. And there wasn't even a blink.
Any principles people expound are not deeply held and thought through, but are simply repeated from they heard somebody give an argument. They didn't think of that argument themselves, and so when 2 years later somebody gives them a new argument that's completely contradictory to what they don't even have cognitive dissonance, because they never actually believed the deep principles they claimed to be espousing and keeping to.
It was tribal affiliation, and it was social status seeking. Yeah. Originally, you did ask a question about is progressivism a new religion, didn't you? Sometime like 15, 20 minutes ago, which I kind of diverted from. Yes, I do think it's a form of religion, and I do think that the iconoclasm that you see, especially in America, it's both political and it's religious. It's the religion of progressivism, of humanism in its most distorted form, and of social justice. And I do believe that that's social justice has many of the characteristics of a religion. So I would say that this was essentially an outbreak of religious iconoclasm, sort of presented as political.
And I always point out that a lot of the progressive causes are kind of ghoulish, distorted versions of sort of puritanical Protestant positions.
Yeah.
So I don't find it that surprising that iconoclasm, being a typically Protestant puritanical expression of religious fervor, should appear as one of the ways that the progressives behave, because their opinions, even though they're not self-consistent, but they do trace back to some quite thoughtful iconoclastic positions of their sort of ideological forebears. Philippocrat says, I'm a little behind in the stream, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on the disconnection that happens between God being perceived through art and art being force separated from divinity. And he clarifies he's talking specifically about the Netherlands after the Reformation. So do you have any immediate spark by that?
Yeah, well, so this is I mean, you have this idea of people treating nature as sort of ersatz idolatry. So you would be worshipping. It's something that came up in our discussion of the Romantics. So the nature becomes your God substitute. And this is not necessarily paganism. This might also be your Christian belief, that as you believe that God made everything, God made the trees and the mountains and the sky and so forth. And so by responding to that, this is a form of religious worship, forceful separation. I mean, there were various sort of edicts regarding religious art, and then you have the Counter Reformation, which comes up where it's specifically artists specifically working on behalf of the Catholic Church, and it's not just religious paintings; it's religious paintings asserting the authority of the Catholic Church to make to be the arbiter of what is religious and what is the appropriate way to worship. So you have the rise of things like the Spanish artists from the 17th century, and you have Zurbarán and so forth. Zurbarán was most famous for painting monks, and so of course the monk becomes like a figure of religious worship, specifically associated with the Catholic Church and with Catholic orders, and that divinity is seen by working through these orders as ordained by the Catholic Church. So the Counter-Reformation is perhaps a better discussion than the Reformation in that subject, that field.
Another comment here from Stephen Bond. The difference between the golden calf and dead religious icons, for example, the temples of the ancient Egyptians, is that the golden calf had religious meaning to the people in that present moment.
Yes, because it's in that time, in that sense, it's a living religion as opposed to, no one is worshipping Baal anymore. I was currently reviewing a book on the Phoenicians, and one of their gods was Baal, apparently. So they are, so no one's worshipping Baal anymore. No one's worshipping the golden calf at the moment, but they were worshipping them at the time. So there was a certain loss of danger or dangerous charge if you're you're speaking religiously when regarding the gods or the icons of past civilizations. That's true.
He kind of continues, whereas there's virtually no risk that people are going to fall into worshipping the idols of the ancient Egyptians. If there was a real risk, then we would have a responsibility to tear them down.
Or maybe to prevent people worshipping them. I don't know if that necessarily includes tearing them down, but
St. Floyd is an object of active progressive worship, and therefore there's a religious obligation to tear down such idols where they are in your power, because they are live religious icons rather than dead.
Yes, well, people have seen the murals of George Floyd. There was I think there was a statue put up as well. So yes, he is being venerated as one of, not particularly, he's one of the martyrs of progressivism. Even though he didn't die for progressivism, he died because of a certain situation that he was in. He wasn't a political person, and he didn't die because of politics. So, yes.
Skelly says, always the bad guys tearing statues down. So Skelly there is expressing.
I think he's coming down strongly on one side of the argument there.
Iconodualism. Is that what you
Iconodualism? Yes. Yeah. There is, unfortunately, there isn't actually a strict antonym to iconoclast. So iconodule means, I think, maker of icons. There isn't one for worshipper of icons, I think. So iconodule is the closest we get to the opposite of an iconoclast.
Yeah. I thought another person that's worth bringing up in this discussion, if we wanted to be somewhat systematic on biblical texts, is Daniel. So a little passage from Daniel 3. King Nebuchadnezzar built a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet thick. That's a pretty big statue.
That's pretty big.
You have to imagine,
presumably not solid gold, because I'm not sure there is enough gold in the world to actually do that.
Nebuchadnezzar was padding his own statue with cheap. Yeah, all right, it's gold coated perhaps. He set it up on the Jura plain in the province of Babylon. He then ordered all the important leaders in the province, everyone who was anybody, to the dedication of the ceremony of the statue. They all came for the dedication. All the important people took their places before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had erected. A herald then proclaimed in a loud voice, "Attention, everyone! Every race, colour, and creed, listen. When you hear the band strike up, all the trumpets and trombones, all the tubas and baritones, the drums and cymbals, fall to your knees and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Anyone who does not kneel and worship shall be thrown immediately into the roaring furnace." Now, apart from the roaring furnace, up till that point, it's sounding very modern to me. Like, think of the compulsory kneeling that happened around the BLM stuff. Even the police, right, were...
Yeah. There was even instances of foot washing as well, and prostration.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, all of this stuff that, when you read it in the Bible, can feel quite outdated and old-fashioned. You realise it's absolutely happening today.
It's hardwired in people. People saying that it's shame. People saying you recant and stuff. People asking for redemption and reparations and stuff. I mean, it's religious language, absolutely, completely.
The band started to play, a huge band equipped with all the musical elements of Babylon, and everyone, every race, colour and creed, fell to their knees and worshipped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. I find that interesting, the reference to every race, colour and creed, a kind of Babylonian globalism being established.
Yeah.
You know, if you're considering yourself the king of the world, amongst your worshippers must be people of every colour, and I wonder if there's an element of that with the drive towards diversity. It is our domain includes the entire human race. There's nobody outside of our control. Now, what then happens is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to do so, and they get sent into the furnace. But when they're in the furnace, they then are saved by God, and they're seen walking around, and they come out completely fine. It says, "But look, I see 4 men walking around freely in the fire, completely unharmed, and the 4th man looks like a son of God." So I think that there's some suggestion that it was either an angel or even perhaps a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus walking around in the fire there. So I think pretty clearly this story is about the fact that God is protecting and supporting those people who refused to kneel or bow or venerate this statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. And in the same way, I think serious thought should be given by Christians today. What might we encounter that would effectively be a request by King Nebuchadnezzar to kneel before his statue? If you find yourself in your job or amongst your friendship group or by police or whoever to make a public declaration of veneration and support to something that you consider to be an idol, and it might literally be an idol. It might literally be a statue of something like King Nebuchadnezzar. What are you going to do in that situation? And I think the pattern we see here is that you should risk everything up to and including being thrown in a furnace and just accept your death rather than bow towards something.
You might say that could relate to a certain medical issue that's ongoing, which we're not going to mention.
Yes. Well, right. So, a stream that I've still failed to get round to doing, but was originally going to be Radlib and AA and I talking about the mark of the beast, which appears in Revelation and describes this mark that people have to have in order to buy and sell, and is a mark of expressing worship of the beast, and that it's notable in the passage that Christians don't fall for this, and it's apparent to them what this is. And I think, therefore, I want to say, I don't think that what's a good euphemism so our stream doesn't get taken down? The procedure that's being recommended to us,
Yes,
it is not, I think, at this stage, doesn't constitute the mark of the beast, because it's not obvious that you have to have it in order to buy and sell. But as it moves in that direction, I think our eyes need to be open and saying, is this something that might...
Well, but by the time it reaches that point, you may already have gone past the point where you could actually prevent it from happening.
Yeah. So I think we should I think keeping our eyes open is because it's worth saying, throughout history there have been Christians claiming that credit cards is the mark of the beast, or social security numbers, or this or that. I think there's a right hesitancy that we should have towards whenever in society everybody is required to do something. We should take a moment and say, are we? If this is mandatory, when does it cross the line into being so when it's mandatory and expresses a worship towards something, I think is probably the pairing that I would argue. I'm still figuring out quite where to land on this question, because I don't want to proclaim something strongly one way or the other here without having fully thought it through. So all I'm saying is, yes, all I'm saying is something for further thought. And if I ever do that stream, then hopefully I will have given it more consideration. Do it on AA's channel though. Don't do it on your channel. Let's not take that. Yes, because this channel is. I'm trying to make some efforts to keep it up, right? If as the censorship increases, we're going to try and stay just shy of the line where we get taken down, and because I think there's value in what we're doing here, continuing for as long as possible, right?
Yeah.
But yes, I just let's see. Even if the procedure is required to buy and sell, the mark of the beast is associated with worship. Okay, well, that's similar to what I was saying. So perhaps as long as the person can take the treatment without worshipping the beast, it's not the biblical reference. Yeah. So I think what I was trying to say was that it's easy to foresee how this could transform into something as described, whereby we see how do you prove that you've had the treatment? Oh, okay, it's an app or whatever. Okay, well, now the app is you're only going to be allowed to buy and sell if you're approved. What else is now required for getting approval on this app? Oh, now you also have to publicly on social media express certain opinions, and those opinions are effectively the digital equivalent of bowing and scraping before an idol. So that's the... If I was to spell out a little bit more explicitly my thinking, that's why I'm so cautious that this is not difficult at all to foresee. I mean, in China, you already have more or less this in operation, and we're quite clearly taking orders, as it were, from the CCP in terms of how we should be running our society. So, yeah, it's it's just on the cusp of possibility. So I think it's worth keeping our eyes open to it.
Yeah, I would almost say that the mobile phone itself is the mark of the beast, but then I'm a techno-skeptic.
I'm increasingly techno-skeptical, but I mean, there's there's an element of hypocrisy in broadcasting over YouTube that we should not
Yes.
use technology. Maybe we're using one thing to subvert itself. I tend to see technology as suspicious, especially because it tends to enable humans to express themselves better, and humans are sinful, and therefore you're kind of you're enabling
You're opening
new
the door to
avenues.
it. It's inevitable. Yeah.
But at the same time, the small number of honourable, good people in the world perhaps should think about how to use technology for good purposes. But with as you say, great.
Oh, you want to use the ring only for good? That's what you're saying.
Am I actually Boromir? Is that what's happening here?
Yes, there you are. You see.
Maybe so. Yeah, well, we mentioned on the stream that we did last week that technology includes, I think you could make a strong case for clothing being a technology, right? It's a tool that's fashioned by humans that provides various things such as warmth and modesty, and God makes garments for Adam and Eve as they're getting cast out of the Garden of Eden. So some people have said that is God's progressing technology. So take that as you will. Okay, a couple more. I seem to have really, maybe not surprisingly, triggered a whole bunch of discussion about Mark of the Beast. So, yeah, we're marked by God. The mark of the beast will try to override this. Hand and forehead equal to actions and thoughts as well. Yes, so that's interesting. Why is it on your hand and on your forehead? Because technology has enabled the ordinary person. Oh no, yes, I assume it being technology has enabled ordinary people to see through organisations like the BBC with the help of people like ourselves. Oh, well, I'm glad to have been in some assistance in that. And of course, Alexander Adams is available at much greater length on with Pharaoh and Panama Hat, right?
Oh yes. So if anyone wants to, I think we actually had a discussion on Iconoclasm. This is on Pharaoh's channel. That's FERRO. We do regular art streams. And that's how I come on thing. Recently we did a 3-part series, basically Panama Hat did a 3-part series on politics and fashion, and I kind of sat in the back and made some flippant comments. So, but often it's the other way around, where I'm leading about art, and he comes in with his sort of erudite knowledge of history. So
it's a great dynamic you have, and I've tuned in and enjoyed many episodes, so I highly recommend go and subscribe to Pharaoh and catch more of Alexander Adams. I just wanted to whip through because we had a set of issues that we wanted to discuss in this stream, so I just want to go through almost as a recap and make sure that we've covered everything we wanted to. So, is the biblical sanction on idol worship consistent throughout Scripture? So I guess I'll give a summary of my thoughts on that. I think we see a very clear Old Testament command against the creation of and the bowing down before any kind of physical object, a representation of something that is either a person or an animal or a fish or the moon or the stars. That is not seen as being in contradiction at all to creating this beautiful place of worship, the temple, which includes they make models, they make statues of angels in there.
Yes, that does seem like a slight contradiction.
Well,
angels technically would not be a sort of corporeal being. So
perhaps that's the get out. That I can't remember any specific instruction to make something non-angelic. So maybe that's the get around, but it does seem like worth thinking about. And certainly that's one of the arguments that's been used as a pro-icon perspective, but it's echoed many times and very strongly that you should be run a mile from anything that you think might be bowing down to an icon. In the New Testament, this same thing is repeated, so it's clearly not one of the things that's gone out with all of the Old Testament laws. It's in fact broadened to include much as, for example, do not sleep with somebody other than your wife is broadened by Jesus to don't even think about it. Like, lust in your heart is as good as the real deed. The same kind of idea, I think, is don't put anything in the place of God as idolatry. And then the representation of Jesus, to me, therefore, is I find I don't think it's a good idea. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
I can understand why there's arguments that say that that Jesus is the incarnate form of God that is therefore different from the calf, for example, that God gives an explicit exception. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument, and I don't think there's an enormous positive benefit to doing so. So I think on the balance, I say depictions of Jesus or depictions of other things like saints and Mary and so on is just way too. You're in risk of impinging one of the very seriously put commandments of God. So I don't think there's a strong enough benefit. Of course, if you are Catholic or Orthodox, then you have explicit tradition that tells you it's fine. So then, if at that point, you've got nothing to worry about, I guess. Is the biblical sanction images of people or all living beings? So I think it would be all living. Don't bow down before a model of a sparrow or whatever. If the Nicene Council had gone the other way, i.e., iconoclasts, if the Nicene Council had said no religious images, how would Western society be different now? Can I pass that over to you for your thoughts?
Very different, and incalculably so. I think we'd look a lot more, visually speaking, we'd look a lot more like the Islamic world, where you'd have abstract designs, you'd have art coming through ornamentation and decoration rather than depiction of figurative imagery. There might also be sort of more pushback against technology, for example. So you've got all these screens and something replicating human forms, natural forms. So there might actually have been a serious pushback against visual imagery and visual technology. So that could be very curious. But I mean, that's so huge that you're getting into the realms of like sort of science fiction there. So who knows?
Yeah, these enormous hypothetical exercises are fun, but there's limit. And I mean, I would say Catholic and Orthodox churches, to me, I think, as well as having more direct iconography, also have more geometric patterns on them, also have more colors and shapes. So in some ways, the Puritan aesthetic is not just absent depictions of people and animals and so on. It's just absent any kind of elaboration at all. It's like it's very functional, actually. It's kind of it's almost, you have to justify everything in terms of what it's doing, rather than it being an embellishment or an accessory, which is an interesting aesthetic. And as you say, it kind of brings up kind of stoic aesthetic as well.
It focuses you. It prevents you from being diverted from sensuality, because of course sensuality is the opposite of the word, because you're led astray by your senses, whereas the word is supposed to be the speech of God in sort of preserved.
Yeah, but I don't know that you could envisage. Well, I mean, minimalism almost feels like, as an art movement, it's already disappearing for us. Like I wonder if we're seeing the end of minimalism. For example, in so web design is probably the area I'm most familiar with trends, and we've seen. So when the iPhone came out, it created a trend and a fashion for skeuomorphism, where everything is depicted as if it were a physical object. Like you go into the games app and it has a faux felt background, and it has three-dimensional shelves with the book, or like you want to read a book and it'll have a spine on a shelf. You turn the page and you see an animation of a page flipping. So there was an enormous push towards creating visuals as though what you were seeing was a physical object, and then we saw that the pendulum swing the complete opposite direction, to everything's going to be totally flat, like the Microsoft flat tiles, and the not even gradients. We're just going to have squares and rectangles with text in, and I think we are already transitioning back out of that. What I almost see amongst the new set of designers coming up and setting trends at this point online would be Zoomers, kind of just coming out of art school or around that kind of age. And the new aesthetic seems to be deliberately ugly. Like I've seen, for example, Arial, the old stock font, the typeface from Microsoft, like Windows 95, but so that font, but stretched, like it's an image that's been badly manipulated, as a kind of ironic reappropriation of bad web design from the mid 90s, has kind of become the new becoming the new aesthetic. This is really a kind of opening a completely separate topic, but how does beauty versus a celebration of things that are not beautiful, that must play in here as well, where we I guess use beauty as a celebration for things that we like, but then we kind of express our nihilism or our cynicism and complicated grey morality in building things that are ugly.
Yeah, but also, of course, the problem is that beauty can. But then once you start to celebrate beauty for beauty's sake, then you start to get led astray by sensuality. So, yeah, it's a tricky issue.
Like I think of ancient Greek statues as celebrating the human form as it is, and I think there's a Christian sense in which I like that, as God has created the human body the way that it is, and to celebrate the human body is also a celebration of God's creation, and almost the view that we should, well, I think the same thing about, like, you put a mask over your face because the human body's not quite good enough as it is. We're going to have to append this functional piece onto it. there's an extent to which it's kind of
well,
all a
that
rejection
was,
of.
yeah, sorry, but then that raises the very tricky question, which I know we're not going to do. We can't discuss, but well, no, it's not. We don't have time to discuss it or expertise.
Yeah.
But then you have the question of circumcision, don't you?
Ah, yes. Well, yeah, interesting. So, in America, as I understand it, there is a general conception that circumcision is necessary on medical grounds. That lots of people will have their children circumcised because the view is that the uncircumcised is unclean, and there's medical problems that can arise from it. Now, whether there's a link to the influence of Judaism on American culture, I'm not sure, but certainly that's not how it's explicitly seen. So actually, I would agree that that reasoning for getting circumcised is similar to what I was just describing, in that it is an expression of the human body as imperfect. And certainly we see in a lot of parts of the world circumcision and female circumcision as well as piercings and all kinds of body modifications and tattoos. And all of this to me springs from a fundamental dissatisfaction with one's body as God has given it to you. And I'd also link into that transgender and other forms of
Dysmorphia.
Psychological, yes, dysmorphia, where you believe that you
dysphoria. Sorry.
Yeah. So a million different connected issues in here, but the the fact that in the Old Testament the Jews were told to be circumcised, well, some people have made the argument that the reason this actually was originally invented was because it did provide a medical benefit while they were like living in the desert.
That's the same argument that goes on about like the dietary rules on shellfish and stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah. It's kind of post facto. Oh, let's say that God did it. Now, of course, because I think that the Bible is straightforwardly telling us the truth rather than giving us a kind of post-fact rationalization, I don't buy into that sort of reasoning. So I think, was circumcision required as a form of religious devotion if you were an ancient Israelite? Yes. Should we circumcise today outside of a specific medical emergency? Then I would say no. And
so please leave a comment below. Leave a like also for us raising such a contentious issue and not going anywhere close to resolving it at the end of a stream.
Sorry, I know you said we don't have time to address it, and then I went and
I knew it was a big issue, and I knew it would stir up the comments, so I thought it would just be fun.
Well, yes, I'm keen to hear people's opinions in the comments down below, or come and join the Discord and have that discussion in there if you'd like. Okay, the Reformation and Iconoclasm, are the two inextricably linked? Do you want to give a?
I would say they are. They're not necessarily. I mean, taken literally, the Reformation just means the removal of these items, or the removal of certain practices in churches. But in practice, of course, it does mean the destruction, or at least the forcible removal, which actually turned out to be often quite violent and irreparable. So yes, I think they are inextricably linked, but not necessarily because of the theology, just simply because any implementation of the theology would have to be done through a degree of violence. So I think they are linked, yes.
Of course, worth mentioning that there were one of the things that the reformers were kicking back against was a lot of the kind of rank materialistic money grabbing stuff that was going on in the Vatican, and certainly the sale of religious
indulgences.
Indulgences, but also pay to come and visit this relic, and you'll get 20 years off your stay in purgatory, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So there's a sense in which if you're rich and powerful and can pay for all of this religious art, that will give you more power and is a natural expression of, forever in human history, rich people have been building things.
So it was the original game as pay to win thing.
Exactly. So there is a sense in which the powerful people have an incentive to encourage the religious significance of very expensive art, because they are the ones who can provide it and then make money off. If it's the case that your religious observance is improved by being able to be in a very expensive environment, then you can control the religious observance of the population. But maybe that's me being cynical. Is modern iconoclasm on ostensibly political grounds actually an expression of progressivism as a new religion? So we've talked about
my view is that it is. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I think everybody has a religious instinct, and the kind of progressive religion is essentially an atheistic religion, I think, in that it makes no superstitious or supernatural claims, and the absence is notable, but simply by not having a supernatural element doesn't exempt you from being labelled as a religion, I think. The atheist, the new atheist talking point was always that there's a uniqueness to atheism because they have zero gods, whereas all other religions have one or more. But the Christian uniqueness has always been having one God rather than many, and I think you can argue that one is just as privileged of a number as zero is. So yes, if you have a religion but no gods, you need to find somewhere to channel the human impulse for worship, and that will inevitably come out in some. If it becomes paganism, you get worship of trees and animals and things, but the political tool of religion has been wielded. You look at the cult of personality in the Soviet Union, where they had blimps flying around with Stalin's head on the side of it, right? It's a very obvious play to say, or North Korea, right? Everybody has to come out and do their
and that literally has him as the founder of the republic, as like the birds all sung, and there were there were miracles. There were literally miracles attributed to his birth. So he was seen as a savior, as a literal savior of the nation, and as having supernatural powers. Well, the supernatural associations.
I tend to see the natural religion, and I've thought this for a long time, in the UK as being the NHS. when the
they're certainly the clergy. They're the clergy of progressivism, which is the cause.
Yeah, people have made the argument that it's sort of universities are the
no, because in the old days you couldn't live outside of religion because it was in every area. NHS is the health services, so all encompassing And so absolute, and it literally cares for, well, supposedly cares from you from cradle to grave. You will not live your life without encountering it, whereas you could live your life without encountering going to a university.
The ceremony when a birth happens is you fill in the certificate with the NHS to register the child's birth. They will encounter you at various times throughout your childhood, and then, of course, when you start to get ill, who it is that you turn to for help? Who was it that we shut down the country for? It was protect the NHS, and we went out as a nation once a week or whenever it was and banged pots and pans. What an incredible!
Did, yes.
Well, yes, no, indeed. I was already very suspicious of this at the time because it seems like such an obvious religious observance of what could be more primitive than just making noise. It was people, vocally or banging objects in like an outward expression to the universe of like praise towards.
It was what was it? Was it 6 o'clock? Was it something like 6 o'clock on a Thursday? They were observing their Sabbath, their progressive Sabbath.
Because the view was we had an enemy, which was COVID, and we had a saviour, which was the NHS, and we had our religious practices to protect it. We wore certain religious garbs. We did the weekly service, the kind of least beautiful form of spoken worship ever produced, which was just like cheering rather than singing or whatever. But
and we have the clergy who sort of stand at the podium, and now since the advent of medical procedures, which we're not going to mention, we now have our heretics.
Yes, indeed, and ultimately the NHS, conducts the funeral and sends your body off into the fires of the furnace or into the ground or whatever. So yeah, I think it's quite reasonable to see our society as having. Where does progressivism fit in with that? I think there's a somewhat uneasy battle going back and forth because I don't think healthism or scienceism is the same thing as progressivism, because after all, science is what do they say? It's the colonialist, white, privileged worldview. So actually, it's there is a disjunct.
But progressivism is progressivism is the ultimate white savior fantasy, though, isn't it? Even though it's being used
that's
against.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
All right. Have you got any final thoughts on the subject of iconoclasm?
No, I think we've covered it. It's just a very stimulating discussion, and thank you for inviting me on. There's lots more to be said, but obviously not here, because I think we've thoroughly mined this subject from the religious angle. So anyway, just thank you for inviting me on.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining. Absolutely, it was fantastic. And once again, do go and pick up a copy of Iconoclasm, Alexander Adams' book. She will find a much more thorough and stimulating exploration of the multiple facets of it. Yes, we actually, I have a stream penciled in on the subject of asceticism as well. So maybe I'll have to figure out if I can add you to that panel too. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
But potentially, I don't see why not.
Yeah. And anyway, what else have I got coming up? Do consider going across and subscribing to my Lambda Daily Scripture channel, which is every day I'm reading another 10-15 minutes of the Bible, and we'll get through the whole thing in a year. I've got a stream coming up on Genesis 50. I think that's everything I have to plug at the moment. I remember I like to finish with some kind of. I like to finish my streams these days with some kind of a doxology or a passage of scripture. So unless you have a particular favourite, I will pull one up now and
please choose at your leisure.
Great. My browser is being incredibly slow. While it's loading, let's just check there aren't any other comments to address. So, based in heretics pill, heretic pilled. Clap for the NHS was apocalyptic levels of cringe.
Thanks for all the comments, by the way. It's really nice to get so many comments. So much appreciated.
Yeah, people have really enjoyed the stream. I think there's lots to chew on, and hopefully those people who are more pro Icon have not been too upset by my treatment of the issue. I've tried to be fair, but ultimately I find it. I can't help but think that there are people in various Christian traditions who are treating their saints and images of Jesus and images of Mary as idols. And I know from having talked to people who are quite thoughtful in Catholic and Orthodox traditions, they will say, no, that's not how we think of it. But there's... I think there's a difference often between the way that the laity think about things and the way that the very informed scholars who are devoted to figuring out what the church teaches think about things. And in practice, I think having icons around is just a very dangerous thing to do. So I'm against it, but I had Settler's Lament been here, I just know he would have been he would have been making a very strong pushback against me. So he'll have to do so in a comment or something. All right, let's finish with a verse from Romans. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with each other, in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ.